The purpose of this seventh audio is to continue the discussion begun in the last audio on the specific mission of Catholic higher education, and especially to concentrate on the academic mission and the support structures for carrying it out. And these two topics overlap with the service that the university provides to the church in the world and its relationship to the local and universal church. But for simplicity's sake, we'll break all this down into first the academic mission and then second, the support mechanisms a university has in place for carrying it out. Exploring this topic again is exploring the substance of the vision in Pope John Paul II's Apostolic Constitution, Ex Corde Ecclesia, which at the same time is the substance of the vision of global leaders in Catholic higher education tracing back to the 1960s and 70s. John Paul II sums up and states in an authoritative document what many others had been saying for the 25 years prior to 1990 when Ex Corde was released. In the last audio, I concentrated on those parts of this vision centered on the kind of community that Catholic universities aspire to be and the means needed to help cultivate that community. And I employed in the last audio two analogies, which I'm going to return to: the analogy of a braided cord with many different strands and the analogy of organ systems of the human body. Each of these aiming to indicate a complex whole composed of various parts working together to support the whole. So I've been trying to separate out some of these parts to help us see the complex whole of Catholic University mission. Anyone who picks up a copy of Ex Corde and reads it will notice that it concentrates most on academics. In fact, mention of community life is a very minor theme. But I think it was helpful to start with that in the last audio because one can see in it fairly clearly the combined elements of openness to the wider world and valuing of the Catholic faith tradition. As we explore the many-layered topic of academics in the vision of Ex Corde, we'll see again this great breadth of engagement with all disciplines and human questions and areas of study, combined with a firm rooting in the Catholic tradition of thinking and reflection in service to the Church's wider mission. It's once again very much a both-and view. So in breaking down what Ex Corde has to say about academics, I'm going to begin by bringing us back once again to the Church's basic understanding of what its mission is. And you'll remember this was covered in the second audio in this series. From there, we'll branch into a discussion of three different ways Catholic universities serve this mission in the area of academics. These center on the Church's advancement of the human condition, its preservation and development of its own cultural and intellectual tradition, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and its promotion of students' search for meaning and purpose, including through the means of faith. Again, the many-layered nature of this academic mission leads me to employ the image of an organ system. Organ systems have many parts, but they work as a whole. So, for example, the respiratory system includes not only the lungs and the diaphragm, but the nose and the trachea as well. So, as we get into discussion of academics, we'll have a number of parts, three parts in particular, to describe. What's at the heart of all of them are ideas, because that's what education is fundamentally about. Understanding and reflection in every discipline and area of human creativity, and how these ideas are applied and expressed in every area of science and culture and human inventiveness. I need to note that my analysis here is very informed by an article by Dennis Holzschneider in the book Ex Corde Ecclesia: Reflections After 30 Years. This article cuts through some of the rather obscure language and references in Ex Corde Ecclesia to really get to the central claims that that document makes in the area of academics. So, to begin, a reminder on the what of mission according to the Catholic Church. And that understanding of mission, as we've seen, is dominated by the idea of the kingdom of God, which is the central teaching that Jesus passed on. The kingdom of God is a vision of a transformed world, a true civilization of love in which human beings would overcome conflicts and transcend unmet human needs and achieve in concrete terms peace and justice for all people. Jesus proclaimed the coming of this kingdom, and his actions and teachings are a message to the entire human race on how all human beings may flourish in every area of life. The good that the Church aims to promote in the world through its mission is a holistic good that seeks the development of every person and of all peoples and cultures, of human bodies and minds and souls, as well as communities and social structures. The Catholic Church's mission is to advance the dignity of every human person and to promote unity overall in the entire human race. That mission involves relieving every form of human suffering and promoting and preserving everything in the world, in creation, that is good and beautiful and uplifts human hearts and souls and communities. Jesus' vision of the kingdom is of a transformed world. And so much of his teaching to his followers was about what would need to change and what people would need to put into practice to help bring that about. The increase in mercy and compassion for all people, inclusion of all people so that everyone has a place of belonging, a breaking down of barriers that keep people alienated and separate, a widening of people's visions, and an expansion of human hearts to enable all people to love more fully and to become fully those whom God intended them to be, while respecting the religious freedom of every person and while seeking to learn from all people and all religious traditions. The Church's mission is also to share what it has learned through revelation about God's hopes for the world, about the possibilities for radical improvement, and about God's accompaniment of human beings and healing, forgiving, supportive presence through all of our trials and varied experiences. So the Christian mission includes the humble sharing of this message of good news for the world and efforts to awaken faith in others, if it's there to be awakened, and also to cooperate with all people, Christian and non-Christian, religious and non-religious, to promote the unity of all people in the world. All of these different things are part of the single but complex reality of the Catholic Church's mission on the whole. The vast majority of what I just described touches on truly universal human hopes. The Catholic Church affirms them, but Catholics are certainly not the only ones that affirm these values or seek for the betterment of humanity as a whole. But these are the values and ideas and moral purposes which animate Catholic education in particular. In fidelity to the mission of Jesus, Catholic universities provide education for these purposes especially, to graduate students and to advance human learning in ways that help meet these larger goals. It's an inherently morally purposed and value-laden kind of education. That's what makes Catholic universities unique, and it's what instills in them a noble purpose above and beyond the unquestionably good and valuable work of all other universities in the world. So with this reminder, of what the Catholic Church on the whole is attempting to achieve, we can now point out the first organ in the larger organ system of the academic mission of Catholic higher education is for Catholic universities, by means of education, to improve the world in these ways, to advance human learning and knowledge in ways that have this effect or serve to promote these values, and to do this in every way that universities do, through research and generation of new knowledge, through teaching, and through services that scholars and universities provide to local communities and the wider world. Education is fundamentally about ideas, and so to whatever extent universities can further and promote not just knowledge in general, but knowledge, ideas, and insights that will help advance moral purposes of these kinds in the world, the better. Doing that is part of their Catholic mission. I'm leaving out here the distinctly faith-related part of the university's service to the world, which has to do with that part of the Church's mission centered on awakening faith in others and announcing the message of salvation. I'll be treating this later as part of the second organ in this academic organ system. Here, though, I'm primarily focusing on the service that universities give to the world, to addressing basic human problems, to promoting justice and peace and the dignity of all people. So let me mention a few places in church teaching, beginning from Vatican II, where this is emphasized as part of what Catholic higher education is all about. The Second Vatican Council's Declaration on Christian Education, Gravissimum Educationis, states that the Church has to do all that it can to promote for all peoples the complete perfection of the human person, the good of earthly society, and the building of a world that is more human. In the years following the Council's close in 1965, leaders of Catholic higher education around the world amplified this theme considerably. Their reflections were summed up in the 1972 document, The Catholic University in the Modern World. This document states that if a Catholic university wishes to fulfill its vocation to be an effective instrument of human progress, it must direct its research, and especially interdisciplinary research, to the urgent problems of social development. Quoting Pope Paul VI, the document encourages Catholic universities to become effectively involved in promoting, quote, the development of those peoples who are striving to escape from hunger, misery, endemic diseases, and ignorance, of those who are looking for a wider share in the benefits of civilization and a more active improvement of their human qualities, of those who are aiming purposefully at their complete fulfillment, unquote. Catholic universities will be able to assist in this way primarily through their own competence as centers of education and research and learning, which is to say, once again, through the generation of useful knowledge and ideas that will serve these higher purposes. Connected with this, the document also points to the importance of teaching ethics. And this is a theme that will grow in significance as church leaders continue to reflect on the university's mission. The document states that in performing its task of preparing leaders both for civil society and for the church, a Catholic university is called upon to give not only scientific and professional training, but ethical teaching as well, based on the imperatives and principles of the gospel. In this way, it will contribute to the education of professional men who will be qualified to work with all others of goodwill for the advancement of all sectors of our pluralistic society, and especially for the achievement of social justice. Thus, it will be an important factor in a progress that is truly human and not material alone. A decade later, in 1980, the U.S. bishops will emphasize this even more in their document entitled Catholic Higher Education and the Pastoral Mission of the Church. Here they make two statements. First, that Catholic colleges and universities have the obligation to study and teach the moral and ethical dimensions of every discipline. And second, that education for justice is to be expected from any university which takes the gospel seriously. The promotion of justice being fundamental and integral to the Church's very own mission. Now, when we get to Ex Corde Ecclesia in 1990, these ideas are amplified in significance and developed even more. John Paul II stresses that both research and teaching at a Catholic university includes an ethical concern. He writes that because knowledge is meant to serve the human person, research in a Catholic university is always carried out with a concern for the ethical and moral implications, both of its methods and of its discoveries. The moral implications that are present in each discipline are examined as an integral part of the teaching of that discipline, so that the entire educative process may be directed towards the whole development of the person. Even more to the point, the Pope writes that Catholic universities should be engaged in the study of serious contemporary problems in areas such as the dignity of human life, the promotion of justice for all, the quality of personal and family life, the protection of nature, the search for peace and political stability, a more just sharing in the world's resources, and a new economic and political order that will better serve the human community at a national and international level. University research will seek to discover the roots and causes of the serious problems of our time, paying special attention to their ethical and religious dimensions. The Christian spirit of service to others for the promotion of social justice is to be shared by its teachers and developed in its students. The Church is firmly committed to the integral growth of all men and women. And the Pope goes on to note that a specific priority for the Catholic University is the need to examine and evaluate the predominant values and norms of modern society and culture in a Christian perspective, to try to communicate to society those ethical and religious principles which give full meaning to human life. Catholic universities will seek to discern and evaluate both the aspirations and the contradictions of modern culture in order to make it more suited to the total development of individuals and peoples. All this constitutes the first academic area of the Catholic mission, and this is a commitment that can be embraced and pursued by all faculty and potentially all disciplines within the university. The same is true also for the other two areas of the academic mission, though in different ways and to different degrees. So let's now move on to a second area. And this is for the university to preserve and develop its own cultural heritage, the Catholic intellectual tradition, in service both to the Church and the world. Now, preserving and passing on knowledge traditions is in some ways what universities do best. In this respect, universities are a lot like libraries or museums. As Dennis Holdschneider notes in the book Ex Corde Ecclesia, Reflections After 30 Years, universities are inherently conservative. We teach ancient languages so that the world can continue to learn from ancient writings. We study people's philosophy and history so that we can understand their actions and learn from them. We study their art and literature so that we can understand their most basic commitments, be inspired to emulate the best in their cultures, or at least not repeat their mistakes. We also protect, publish, and display the artifacts of current cultures, turning them into learning opportunities so we appreciate those who are different, creating a more understanding world. We are home to departments of Irish studies, African studies, Near Eastern institutes, and so much more. We record and perform their music. We study social arrangements and political structures. In doing so, we show humanity to humanity. Even more, he writes, we advance the cultural work of the present. We teach artists, musicians, poets, writers, historians, philosophers, architects, and all the many disciplines through which the variety of human culture and self-understandings come to life, deepen, come into conflict, and enrich one another in new and creative ways. And most importantly, we bring the ideas of past cultures to bear upon the present. This work of cultural preservation and analysis and continued cultural creation is basic to all universities. And in a Catholic university, it is the culture and traditions and history of Catholicism that is especially treasured and preserved and developed in new ways in the present. All of this is what's sometimes called the Catholic intellectual tradition. But we have to understand this term broadly to include all the cultural expressions of Catholicism, not just the obviously intellectual in the sense of conceptual fields of theology or philosophical thinking. We need to also include Catholic works of imagination in the areas of art and architecture, music, literature, poetry, and many other areas. This broad view of the Catholic intellectual or cultural tradition would include, therefore, also church history and spiritual tradition and worship and liturgical traditions, and the stories past and present of key figures and institutions within the church. Catholic universities are places where this heritage is treasured and preserved and extended, deepened through research and scholarly work, and passed down in publication, teaching, and in service to the wider Christian community. When one reads the opening paragraphs and pages of John Paul II's Ex Corde Ecclesia, one immediately encounters this understanding of the university's academic mission. John Paul II doesn't immediately put it in these terms. Instead, he talks about the dialogue between faith and reason, and the unity of truth and the integration of knowledge around a coherent vision of the world and life, which includes faith. But he's really getting at the same thing, the same idea. In his vision, and in the vision of Catholic higher ed leaders going back more than 2 decades before him, Catholic universities are understood as places where there is reflection on the Christian faith in light of every discipline, where each discipline is researched and taught in light of the Christian faith. Especially with research, then, there is the creation of new knowledge within the Catholic intellectual tradition. And it is especially in teaching that that tradition, that cultural tradition, is passed down and communicated. So to take a step back again from all this, Ex Corde Ecclesia, echoing earlier Catholic documents and voices, sees Catholic universities as places where faculty explore the interactions between current problems and developments in their fields with past contributions of the Catholic tradition for the purpose of continuing the dialogue and interchange between the gospel or the Christian message and the fundamental convictions of the Christian faith and all the developments and issues of modern cultures and modern societies. Now, in hearing this description, if you're wondering who are all of the sociologists and historians and political scientists and professors of English and business and physics and nursing and art who are not only capable of engaging with the Catholic tradition in any depth, but motivated to do so, then you're not crazy, you're just observant that this is not how Catholic universities in the United States have evolved since Vatican II, to really prioritize study and reflection and teaching and scholarship on the Catholic intellectual tradition. And that point should be fairly clear from the history that we've gone over. But in the years after the Second Vatican Council, this was what was anticipated and upheld as an ideal. And it makes more sense when you think about at that time in the late 60s and early 70s, there were still a predominant number of Catholics on the faculties. The hope was that as scholars with terminal degrees and members of the church, they would be both capable and willing to make these kinds of intellectual contributions. And some certainly did, But as we saw, the historical forces tended to push in the other direction, towards greater autonomy and freedom for faculty, toward the greater professionalization of various fields and departments, making faculty's primary loyalties to the secular norms of their disciplines, and toward reshaping of curriculum to downplay the role of the Catholic dimension of theology and philosophy, especially to promote greater choice for students. These factors, along with not prioritizing hiring for mission, allowed this dimension of the Catholic academic mission to drift. In fact, it's this very situation of the university's commitment to its own Catholic tradition slipping away that led Pope John Paul II in Ex Corde to emphasize this part of a university's Catholic mission so strongly. As Holtschneider notes, John Paul II sought to tie the collective work of scholars in these universities to the work of the Church. It was an encouragement born of concern that these institutions, or at least individuals therein, might not always see their work's connections to both Christ and the Church. So John Paul II saw what was happening and issued Ex Corde, in part as a challenge to the universities to reinvigorate their cultural study and preservation and contributions to the Catholic intellectual tradition. In fact, if you look at 2 of the 4 characteristics of Catholic universities that he introduces at the very start of his apostolic constitution, they pertain directly to this issue. So I mentioned the first of these essential characteristics in the last audio, and that was a Christian inspiration not only of individuals, but of the university community as such. That one focuses on community life and on hiring and personnel. The second one is this, that every Catholic university as Catholic must engage in continuing reflection in the light of the Catholic faith upon the growing treasury of human knowledge, to which it seeks to contribute by its own research. That is, it must be preserving and contributing to, adding to the cultural heritage of Catholicism through the contributions of various disciplines. The third characteristic goes along with this one, that is, when that cultural contribution is made, adding to the Catholic intellectual tradition, those contributions must stand in fidelity to the Christian message as it comes to us through the Church. That is, those contributions must authentically communicate the Christian message and not damage or distort it or in any way mischaracterize it. And that characteristic was subject to intense scrutiny, especially by theologians and universities that wanted to insist on their autonomy, as well as their ability to authentically advance the tradition without doctrinal oversight or interference. But leaving that issue aside for the moment, the point is that the vision here presented is that Catholic universities would be places where the Catholic faith is investigated and explored throughout the various disciplines, and where Catholic thought and music and literature and history and Catholic social thought in connection to the various sciences and social sciences and problems of the day, that Catholic universities would be little meccas of Catholic cultural creativity and interest. Once again, this was not John Paul II's individual fanciful notion. The image of Catholic universities as these kinds of places goes all the way back to the years right after the Council. If one looks at the 1967 Land O'Lakes Statement of North American leaders of Catholic higher education, there is an emphasis not only on the important contributions of the theological faculty, but on interdisciplinary dialogue in which theology confronts all the rest of modern culture and all the areas of intellectual study. So it's a picture of theology or the Christian faith in dialogue with all other disciplines. enriching itself through interaction with other fields of study, and that enrichment going the other direction as well, stimulating the internal development of the non-theological disciplines. The Land O'Lakes statement puts it this way: in a Catholic university, all recognized university areas of study are frankly and fully accepted, and their internal autonomy affirmed and guaranteed. There must be no theological or philosophical imperialism. All scientific and disciplinary methods and methodologies must be given due honor and respect. However, there will necessarily result from the interdisciplinary discussion an awareness that there is a philosophical and theological dimension to most intellectual subjects when they are pursued far enough. Hence, in a Catholic university, there will be a special interest in interdisciplinary problems and relationships. For this to happen, the document then notes, not only must Catholic universities have a broad array of disciplines and achieve real academic excellence in those areas, it must also have Christian scholars who are not only interested in and competent in their own fields, but also have a personal interest in the cross-disciplinary confrontation. 5 years later, in the document, The Catholic University and the Modern World, that very same vision is communicated. That document states that one of the principal tasks of a Catholic university, and one which it alone is able to accomplish adequately, will be to make theology relevant to all human knowledge, and reciprocally, all human knowledge relevant to theology. There is a profound harmony, as the Catholic Church sees it, between all human learning and all culture and the specific truths of the Catholic faith. Culture, the document states, is a stimulus for the believer, for it is the knowledge of the work of the Creator and of His wisdom spread throughout creation and in the hearts of men. By initiating men to an ever wider knowledge of natural truth, culture opens the way to a fruitful encounter with revealed truth, for the believer cannot afford not to seek for a harmonious synthesis between these two domains of truth. The document goes on to note that Vatican II actually called for Catholic universities to make this kind of contribution, to make it more deeply understood how faith and reason give harmonious witness to the unity of all truth, how Christian belief harmonizes with all learning, and in a special way with the natural and social sciences. So 2 decades later, when Ex Corde comes out and John Paul II makes similar statements, the vision of this part of a Catholic university's academic mission is still maintained, and perhaps even more strongly maintained in light of what U.S. Catholic universities had faced in particular. This vision also shows up in canon law, particularly Canon 811, which states that in individual Catholic universities there are to be classes which especially treat those theological questions which are connected to the disciplines of their faculties. And this vision shows up also in several statements of the U.S. bishops, application for Ex Corde Ecclesia for the United States, which was released in the year 2000. And some of these statements include the following. Academic events should be organized on a regular basis to address theological issues, especially those relative to the various disciplines taught in the university. Catholic teaching should have a place, if appropriate to the subject matter, in the various disciplines taught in the university. And most importantly, the statement that the university shall develop and maintain a plan for fulfilling its mission that communicates and develops the Catholic intellectual tradition. So right there, I think most clearly we see this emphasis on the preservation and development of the Church's own intellectual culture. And here in this document, the U.S. bishops are not just repeating John Paul II or global Catholic higher ed leaders, they're also repeating themselves in earlier statements they had made. Their 1972 document, To Teach as Jesus Did, a pastoral message on Catholic education, includes the statement that everything possible must be done to preserve the critically important contribution made by Catholic institutions through their commitment to the spiritual, intellectual, and moral values of the Christian tradition. Their students have a right to explore the distinctively Catholic intellectual patrimony, which affirms, among other things, the existence of God and His revelation in Jesus Christ as ontological facts and essential elements in seeking and sharing truth. A decade later, in their statement, Catholic Higher Education and the Pastoral Mission of the Church, they make two statements, one on theology and one on the liberal arts. Their statement on theology is that the distinguishing mark of every Catholic college or university is that, in an appropriate academic fashion, it offers its students an introduction to the Catholic theological heritage. In terms of liberal arts, this document then states that a necessary, though not sufficient, element in the identity of undergraduate programs in Catholic institutions is the provision of a liberal education of high quality. But that education must go beyond secular humanism, which also emphasizes the liberal arts. Catholic institutions of higher learning can uniquely fuse the theological study of arts and sciences with light of faith in the synthesis we call Christian and Catholic humanism. That synthesis provides an integral view of human existence, one that gives true meaning, purpose, and value to the study of all disciplines. We are concerned that the erosion in the teaching of the liberal arts in American higher education today might compromise their important part in teaching the ideals of Christian humanism. That is why we urge Catholic colleges and universities to preserve and strengthen the teaching of the liberal arts in undergraduate and pre-professional education. Particularly in professional and graduate programs, the faculty and students should address the human and religious issues that are intrinsic to a humane education. An institution's Catholic identity is largely expressed in a curriculum that shows how the values of the Judeo-Christian view of life illuminate all fields of study and practice. So, in sum, we can say that across more than 50 years of reflection, the Catholic Church's teaching on higher education is unambiguous on this point with regard to preserving and extending the Catholic intellectual tradition in the university setting. Fulfilling this task is not only understood as simply a natural consequence of a Catholic university's identity as Catholic. It's also connected to the university's obligation to serve the Catholic Church more broadly and in a variety of ways. To quote a few phrases from the Catholic University in the Modern World, by assuring an effective presence of the truth of the Christian message at the level of university teaching and research, Catholic universities help prepare future leaders of the Church. As Pope John Paul II puts it, through teaching and research, a Catholic university offers an indispensable contribution to the Church. In fact, it prepares men and women who, inspired by Christian principles and help to live their Christian vocation in a mature and responsible manner, will be able to assume positions of responsibility in the Church. And in another place he states that graduates are prepared to give the witness of their faith to the world, which echoes a line from the Vatican II Declaration on Christian Education, specifically pertaining to universities. Moreover, by supporting the work of theologians, Catholic universities offer tremendous intellectual support for all areas of the Church's life of faith. They help the Church respond to contemporary problems and needs. They deepen the Church's understanding of all areas of its tradition. They assure the more effective spreading and communication of the gospel message. They advance ecumenism and interreligious dialogue and affairs. In all these ways and in many others, Catholic universities fulfill part of the teaching function of the Catholic Church, which they share with the bishops, the hierarchy. In the words of the Land O'Lakes document from 1967, they serve to some extent as the critical reflective intelligence of the Church. In doing this, Catholic universities offer an enormous support for the explicitly religious components of the Catholic Church's mission. By that I mean those components that focus especially on proclaiming the good news of Christianity, assisting Catholic and Christian men and women to grow in their faith, and in every way communicating the life of Christ to those who would believe. In an environment in which more and more students attending Catholic universities are not Catholic or Christian or religious, these services which Catholic universities provide should not be confused with a mass program of evangelization delivered through the curriculum. That's not what Catholic universities do, and that's in contradiction to the Church's commitments to the religious freedom of every person. My point, rather, is that by Catholic universities being committed to holding on to and continuing their distinctive cultural and intellectual heritage, that these advantages all are natural outcomes. Research and study and teaching in the Catholic intellectual tradition has these effects, and it's worth naming them just to point out the good work that universities do for the larger church. Now this brings us to the third area of the Catholic University's academic mission. And this is where we see more clearly a hope for every student who would attend a Catholic college or university, regardless of whether they're Catholic or Christian or religious or not. This is a goal to help further every student's search for meaning and purpose in life. This is something Catholic universities can and do hope for every student. And this is more precisely the hope that is attached to students' study and exposure to the Catholic intellectual tradition. It's not to make them Catholic if they're Baptist or Muslim or agnostic, but it is to help each individual in their search to make sense of life and to find truly meaningful and fulfilling paths for their futures. Now, this goal, or part of the academic mission, is less well emphasized than the first two I've gone over, but it is definitely present, especially in Ex Corde Ecclesia. In that document, John Paul II emphasizes the role of the Catholic University in promoting students' acquisition of a higher synthesis of knowledge and a coherent vision of how all that they're learning in all of their subjects fits together into a whole which unifies all truth and which addresses the most fundamental questions, the biggest questions humans can ask. Embracing, of course, questions about the meaning of human existence, why we're all here, and what good and worthy goals of human living are. When one thinks about the breadth of the Catholic intellectual tradition, touching on so many different literary and artistic and imaginative expressions, and in the thoughts and reflections of so many great philosophers and theologians, and in the examples of numerous exemplary moral and religious figures, I hope it's clear that by reflection on such a broad and inspiring tradition, all students can be aided in their search for the ultimate truth and meaning and purpose of their existence. This kind of education, especially when it engages thoughtfully views and philosophies and human experiences that are not religious and Christian or Catholic, provides students the opportunity to think through these matters on their own, when otherwise in our very this-worldly social environment, they don't receive much encouragement to do so. And this is one of the tremendously important selling points of a Catholic university education, that it encourages every student to address the fundamental questions and engage the great minds with a direct encouragement to each of them to clarify for themselves what kind of world, what kind of universe they think they're living in, or what kind of story they think they're a part of, in the sense of the fundamental story of life as a whole. No one can do this work for an individual student. They must do it for themselves. But Catholic universities can encourage students to do it and point to the very great importance of this task, that we humans not live superficially or only on the surface of things, that we not live uncritically, and that we come alive to our own potential to probe the mysteries of life more deeply and come closer to the truth. That's why the U.S. bishops in their 1980 pastoral letter emphasized so strongly the value of the liberal arts. Not only does the liberal arts open these wide horizons in general, but bringing in Catholic cultural contributions to the liberal arts can help provide an integral view of human existence, one that gives true meaning, purpose, and value to the study of all the disciplines. This kind of study, in other words, gives students an opportunity to pull together the various facets and domains of their learning into a higher synthesis that may actually include faith or may not. Again, that's their call. But at a Catholic university, unlike a secular or public university, the faith perspective is not excluded or diminished or undermined by spoken or unspoken assumptions about reality only being material or science being the only way of knowing or this world and this life only being about what we individually can make of it. These are certainly assumptions and views worth considering, and at Catholic universities they wholeheartedly are examined and considered, but in connection and in dialogue with many others as well that open up transcendent and religious possibilities. Study of the Catholic intellectual tradition and the liberal arts certainly does this, and so too does philosophy especially. And this is one of the reasons why Catholic universities continue to have a very strong tradition of teaching philosophy. As we saw in the fourth lecture, the old neo-scholastic curriculum was primarily geared towards keeping Catholics Catholic, helping them defend the faith and understand it better against all sorts of critical intellectual challenges. With Vatican II, that neo-scholastic approach went away and was replaced by a more open and rigorous philosophical pursuit that serves the individual's quest for meaning and truth over all questions and areas of human inquiry. Philosophy at Catholic universities very much remains the handmaiden of the theological quest and the quest for meaning overall. In 1980, the U.S. bishops write that another major concern of ours is the study of philosophy. We do not see philosophy as merely one more subject area in the field of the liberal arts, nor as an academic luxury for those of a speculative bent, but rather as an essential component of any education worthy of the name. It is philosophy which familiarizes the student with the laws and patterns of human thought. It brings the student to face, in a disciplined academic fashion, the great questions about God, the world, and humanity. Without solid philosophical grounding, both teachers and students in all fields of study cannot avoid the risk of superficiality and fragmentation. So once again, it serves the unity of all knowledge, students' efforts to bring together into a whole all that they're learning, and their examination of life's deepest questions and mysteries, which overlaps with consideration of religious possibilities. The bishops note too in 1980 that they understand that theological education has changed since the Second Vatican Council. Catholic universities are not simply about protecting the faith of Catholic students, so they understand the more academic approach of contemporary courses in theology and religious studies. Yet they note that theology should enable students to think and to act within a vision of life that includes religious values. Putting these two things together, theology and philosophy, faith and reason, Ex Corde Ecclesia notes that a vital interaction of these two distinct levels of coming to know the one truth leads to a greater love for truth itself and contributes to a more comprehensive understanding of the meaning of human life and of the purpose of God's creation. So philosophy and theology are singled out here and in Ex Corde Ecclesia and other church documents, but the prior emphasis we saw on interdisciplinary studies and on the Catholic intellectual tradition touching and embracing potentially all disciplines indicates, I hope, that all faculty at a Catholic university and all departments and disciplines can potentially contribute in this way towards helping students acquire an overall vision of what their education is aiming for and a comprehensive vision of what their lives and their studies are for, what good they can hope to achieve in the world, and what contribution they could potentially make in connection to the world's great needs and problems. The ethical and moral strand of the Catholic intellectual tradition, which we saw as the first part of this academic mission, also is directly connected with this third one: to serve the world, to serve others, to improve circumstances for future generations, to defend human dignity and promote the protection of nature, to alleviate human suffering, and to develop economies and civil societies and opportunities for every form of human flourishing. There is great meaning and purpose in all of these activities, and Catholic universities directly want to encourage every student to think about those things, to engage with these possibilities for their own lives. Here at Clark University, we have an institutional learning outcome called the spirituality outcome, and it's directly intended to meet these larger purposes for student development, to help them reflect on how they see their lives and the world, what goals are worth them giving their lives to, why we're all here, and whether there's a God or something higher to make sense of our living, and what we can hope for in terms of improvements in human living and happiness for ourselves. These are all the very broad perspectives which I discussed in the third audio under the heading of the where of mission. What kind of universe or world do we think we're living in right now? Where are we? An education which fails to help students to answer those big questions in some ways leaves them lost and marooned, because we're part of this universe. And to the extent that we really haven't thought about what this larger thing is that we're a part of, then in some important way we really don't know who we are or where we're going. So assisting students to undertake this intellectual and spiritual search is a third very important academic goal of Catholic universities. Where students end up as a result of that search is not for the university to determine, though it certainly prizes and wants to share the treasures of the Catholic insight into these questions with ecumenical and interreligious sensitivities and with great open-mindedness. The results of this quest are students' own business, for this sort of journey is a very personal one. But Catholic universities want to make sure they have some resources for making it, because they see such a journey as essential to the good life of every human being. So this brings to a close my discussion of the academic component of the mission. And I think once again, given the complexity of what I've just described, the organ system analogy is a good one. We're talking about an academic mission that includes both moral goals to help transform the world for the better, goals of Catholic cultural preservation and continuation, and a spiritual aim to help every student find greater meaning and purpose through study of the Catholic intellectual tradition in connection with the liberal arts more broadly and philosophical and religious exploration. It's a complex package that can potentially involve every department and discipline and faculty member in different ways with all three goals. And all this together is part of what makes Catholic higher education unique. Now there's one further organ system I need to describe, one further crucial area of a Catholic university's mission. And this has to do with the support structures in place to make sure that the academic mission is carried out. I refer to this in the fifth audio as the new skeleton that needed to be created in Catholic universities as members of the founding religious congregations became less and less over time. I alluded to some of what that new skeleton involves in that audio, But now I need to connect those observations with the requirements in Part 2 of Ex Corde that assign ultimate accountability for a Catholic university staying Catholic to the bishop or the hierarchy. So this will get us into the topic of the university's relationship to the wider church, how Ex Corde and the U.S. application for Ex Corde see that relationship playing out and being maintained, and overall what supports are in place within a university or college to ensure especially that the academic mission is pursued in the ways we've just described. So what I'm going to get into next is a parallel to what I described in the last audio, where first I talked about the kind of community Catholic universities aspire to be, and then second, the supports or conditions to ensure that that community is maintained. Here now we need to look at the supports or conditions for ensuring that the Catholic academic mission is pursued. So this is the fourth and final organ system I'm going over between these two audios, or to use my other analogy, the fourth strand in the braided cord of Catholic higher education. So what is this part of the mission all about? Where does one see it, and who is most responsible for carrying it out? This part of the mission is the hardest for most members of the university community to see and to describe. It's not directly about what happens in the classroom, but about what happens outside the classroom to ensure that the academic mission that I just described is known and understood and supported enough so that it can actually take place. In the second of the history audios, I described the realization that began to sink in the late 80s and 90s that in various areas, including in academics and the curriculum, Catholic universities had let go or failed to hold on to important parts of their intellectual tradition. So there began to be a movement to reclaim that, which occurred mostly internal to the Catholic university community in the U.S., but which was stimulated by Ex Corde Ecclesia, certainly. This was the new skeleton that I had earlier described in terms of a whole set of rejuvenation efforts in U.S. Catholic higher ed to begin to concentrate on the Catholic identity of the university, to promote hiring for mission and professional development opportunities for faculty, administration, staff, and trustees, allocation of endowment and fundraising to support initiatives in Catholic identity, the articulation of best practices in mission integration, the institution of mission offices and mission officer positions, the development of new academic programs such as Catholic studies, the institution of assessments of Catholic identity, and of local, national, and congregational networks to promote Catholic identity, especially among schools of a similar foundation, such as Jesuit schools, Mercy schools, Franciscan schools, and so on. And I mentioned in going over this that the institutions that began to move in this direction had really clarified for themselves more fully how they were going to be Catholic, and in a way that embraced the basic vision that I have been describing and that was expressed in Ex Corde Ecclesia. These institutions moved out of the Catholic identity crisis phase into a phase of vision, implementation, and action. All these efforts were geared toward helping what was recognizably a workforce of lay Catholics and lay non-Catholics who, no matter what, needed to be trained and formed to carry out this academic mission. Now, of course, as I mentioned in the last audio, right alongside this, there were also developments to cultivate student affairs and other methods to help foster the specific Catholic campus community environment. These two were part of the same mission rejuvenation effort. But here I'd like to especially concentrate on the academic dimension and the support for the distinctly Catholic academic goals. All of these different developments, to the extent to which a particular institution could take part in them and fund them and institute them, began to build up the kind of strong skeletal support structure that would serve the same purpose as significant numbers of members of the founding religious order. These different developments in a spectrum of different degrees of implementation began to have this sort of effect. Again, in recounting that history, I alluded to the fact that the spectrum is quite wide, and that numerous institutions may not have begun to implement many of these practices at all, or that did for a time, started and stopped, or for any number of legitimate reasons, especially financial pressure, or isolation from other Catholic universities, or the numerous pushes and pulls of the changing higher ed environment, occasionally lost a focus on mission, and not having tended to it, gradually lost more capacity to do so. It's to institutions more on this end of the spectrum that this last area of mission pertains. In fact, the mission may simply be summarized as build a new skeleton, build a new support structure for the vibrant carrying out of your academic mission, or rebuild it, or revise it, or to whatever degree it's languishing, tend to it. Because the mission is so complex and pervasive across the institution, as we've seen, and it's something that would need to be carried out over and above the professional training of a chemist or a nurse or an historian or social worker. This area of the Catholic University's mission is about addressing the most fundamental conditions to enable this to happen, which are the conditions most set by the university leaders. So this part of the university's mission concentrates on administrators and trustees especially taking responsibility for the mission, studying it, understanding it, and beginning to implement it to whatever degree in whatever area this has not yet quite taken place or taken place adequately. Now, everyone across the university, faculty, staff, and administrators together share in responsibility for different aspects of the mission. We saw that already noted in connection to hiring in the last audio, but this part of the mission centers most on the responsibilities of leadership. I mentioned in the fifth audio that this was a sore point for almost 2 decades between Vatican officials and leaders of U.S. Catholic higher education. The presidents insisted unsuccessfully that they could uphold the Catholic identity of their institutions entirely on their own, and the Vatican replied that precisely as Catholic, a radical independence is not possible. And even more concretely, in the second part of Ex Corde Ecclesia, a series of norms or rules was laid out, essentially saying that bishops have a responsibility for making sure that Catholic universities remain Catholic, according to the vision we've described, and that administrators and trustees have special duties that they need to carry out if they are not already doing so. I'll get to those duties shortly, but the fundamental point is that however decentralized Catholic universities may be in the United States or around the world, as Catholic, every Catholic university has a relationship both to the local and the universal church that is essential to its institutional identity. As John Paul II writes in Ex Corde, each institution participates in and contributes to the life and mission of the universal church, and it assumes consequently a special bond with the Holy See, the Vatican, by reason of the service to unity which it is called to render to the whole church. One consequence of this is that the university must recognize and adhere to the teaching authority of the church in areas of faith and morals. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot that this document then goes into with regard to the work of theologians, making sure they teach in a way that authentically presents the church's doctrines. I'm not going to dwell on this point any further than I already have, because the mission, as I've described it, is much bigger than the work of theologians. So, assuming that theologians are doing what they are asked to do, what else are university leaders asked to do? To answer this question, let me start with the norms or rules in Ex Corde, and then move to the U.S. Bishop's document from the year 2000, the application for Ex Corde for the United States. Trustees are identified as having primary responsibility for maintaining and strengthening the Catholic identity of the university. Therefore, they are to recruit adequate personnel who are willing and able to promote this identity. Ex Corde states specific hopes and expectations for those who are hired, but again, to just concentrate on the mission of leadership, they are asked to be sure that the university makes known its identity as Catholic, either in a mission statement or some other appropriate document, and that the university, through its structure and its regulations, provides means which will guarantee the expression and preservation of this identity in a manner consistent with Catholic ideals, principles, and attitudes. University leaders, furthermore, are to ensure that the university remains in close communion with the local church, in particular with the diocesan bishop, and that in ways consistent with its nature as a university, it contributes to the church's work of evangelization. University leaders are to support campus ministry and promote the pastoral care of all members of the university. And in addition, because the bishop has a duty to watch over and preserve and strengthen the Catholic character of the institution, university authorities are to share relevant information with the bishop of the diocese in which the university belongs to help him do this. Ex Corde then closes with an emphasis on the renewal of Catholic universities and a reaffirmation of the great mission that the Church entrusts to them. It is a significant mission, one that holds a cultural and religious meaning of vital importance. Now, 10 years after Ex Corde, the U.S. bishops issue their application for the United States, and what one sees here is a greatly expanded list of duties, especially for administrators and trustees, again to ensure that they are successfully implementing the vision of Ex Corde, the vision of academics and community that we've been reviewing. This document is broken into two parts, and the first part touches on a number of the dimensions of the Catholic University mission we've gone over in this audio and the last. But it stresses most of all the relationship between the university and the wider church, particularly the local bishop. This seems primarily not just to establish lines of authority to connect the university to the bishop in order for the bishop to say this or that. That's certainly going on, but I think more importantly, what it's attempting to do is to counteract the cultural isolation of some Catholic universities that is a consequence of their decentralization in the American context, where each university is essentially governing itself with an independent lay board of trustees. The document insists, by contrast, that if an institution is a ministry of the Catholic Church, like Catholic universities are, then trustees and administrators really need to see themselves functioning as responsible leaders within a local Catholic Church ministry. And as part of the wider milieu of Catholic institutions, they need to support the wider mission of the Catholic Church. So I see this part of the U.S. application as trying to expand the understanding and vision of university leaders so that they understand the larger Catholic world of which they are a part and their obligations to fulfill the essential requirements of that identity. Part 2 of the U.S. application is the list of particular norms or rules, and they are introduced with a statement that reads, "The chief purpose of the following norms is to assist Catholic colleges and universities in their internal process of reviewing their Catholic identity and clarifying their essential mission and goals. They are intended to provide practical guidance to those committed to the enterprise of Catholic higher education as they seek to implement the theological and pastoral principles of Ex Corde Ecclesia." Accordingly, the norms follow the basic outline of the general norms found in Ex Corde Ecclesia and provide concrete steps that will facilitate the implementation of the Holy Father's document in the context of the relevant sections of the Code of Canon Law and complementary church legislation. Then the document goes on to list the specifics, and again, here I am highlighting especially the tasks assigned to leaders, to trustees and administrators. Here I will simply list the most important points. Catholic universities are to make their own the general and particular norms of Ex Corde and the U.S. application by incorporating them in the university's official documentation. They are to recognize the duty of the diocesan bishop to safeguard and promote the integrity and unity of the faith as it is presented in these institutions. And they are to affirm the essential characteristics of a Catholic university in accord with the principles of Ex Corde Ecclesia, both in writing, in official documentation, and in a mission statement, but also in action in the university's commitment to the practical implications of that identity. The U.S. application then repeats Ex Corde's statement that everyone working at the university has a responsibility to promote the mission and identity of the institution. But again, to concentrate especially on what is said of the leadership, there are a number of statements about the Board of Trustees, that each member of the board should be committed to the practical implications of the university's Catholic identity, that the majority of the board should be Catholics, which is something we saw in the last audio, that the board should develop effective ways of relating to and collaborating with the local bishop and diocesan agencies on matters of mutual concern, that the board should analyze ecclesiastical documents on higher education, such as Ex Corde Ecclesia in this application, and develop specific ways of implementing them appropriate to the structure and life of the university. And this statement makes quite clear that the U.S. bishops, reflecting in the late 90s on more than 3 decades of the experience of Catholic higher education after the Second Vatican Council, were concerned that the vision quickly developed after the Council was no longer adequately known or supported. And this is the identity crisis we've described. The document then goes on to state that the board should see to it that the university periodically undertakes an internal review of the congruence of its mission statement, its courses of instruction, its research program, and its service activity with the ideals, principles, and norms expressed in Ex Corde. To jump ahead to a later part of the document, certainly connected with an internal assessment or review, the U.S. application states that the university shall develop and maintain a plan for fulfilling its mission that communicates and develops the Catholic intellectual tradition, is of service to the Church and society, and encourages the members of the university community to grow in the practice of the faith. The university plan should address intellectual and pastoral contributions to the service of communicating gospel values, service to the poor, social justice initiatives, and ecumenical and interreligious activities. That sums up the major duties of the trustees. Now, to add a few words here about the administration, there is the statement that the university president should be a Catholic, and that the administration should be in dialogue with the local bishop about ways of promoting Catholic identity and the contribution that the university can make to the life of the church in the area. There are then further statements about hiring in connection to mission and identity, informing faculty and staff at the time of their appointment regarding the Catholic identity, mission, and religious practices of the university, and that the university should strive to the degree possible to recruit and appoint Catholics as professors so that they constitute the majority of the faculty, something we looked at in the last audio. There are then more specifics about the kinds of courses that are offered at Catholic universities, including Catholic theology, taught in an authentic manner, opportunities for students to be educated in the Church's moral and religious principles and social teachings, as well as to participate in the life of faith, the place of Catholic teaching where appropriate in the various disciplines taught in the university, and adequate instruction on professional ethics and moral issues. all topics we've already covered in terms of the kind of academic mission the university is to be engaged in. So, as not to repeat myself too much, what really stands out in this document from the year 2000 is the emphasis on the university authorities truly taking responsibility for these things. And in light of Ex Corde, the institution of a formal relationship between the university authorities and the local bishop, so that these matters can all be attended to in partnership. So finally, then, there is a reaffirmation that the local bishop has a responsibility to promote the welfare of the Catholic universities in his diocese and to watch over the preservation and strengthening of their Catholic character. And therefore, diocesan and university authorities should commit themselves mutually to regular dialogues to achieve the goals of Ex Corde Ecclesia according to local needs and circumstances. Together, they should develop practical methods of collaboration that are harmonious with the university's structures and statutes. All this constitutes a rather serious list of duties that fall particularly on administrators and trustees, and so that's why I've separated them out here in this analysis. I think collectively, the mission which involves fulfilling all of these duties is meant to inject or support some spine in a few institutions that may have neglected these things. That at least seems the well-meaning intention. And to whatever degree this may actually be needed in a particular Catholic institution, these sorts of activities occurring on the level of the board and administration's relationship with the local bishop can help set the conditions to ensure that the academic vision that the Church and Catholic university leaders have worked out since Vatican II is put into play, or more put into play if it's overly diminished at a particular college or university. This then can reinvigorate efforts to build up the other kind of internal skeleton I was mentioning earlier, all of the different initiatives to equip faculty especially to teach the Catholic intellectual tradition and to promote the Church's social mission and the spiritual growth and development of students in their search for meaning and purpose. These things don't happen without a vision for them to happen and without a lot of support to enable this to occur. And so that's what this fourth part of a Catholic university's mission is all about. A duty and a strategy and a series of activities and commitments to make sure the rest of the mission, particularly the academic mission, is supported and pursued. All this is a checklist laying out what Catholic university leaders, at the very least, including trustees, need to do in order for the complex whole of the Catholic university mission to be maintained and pursued and not reduced to something less than what it fully is. And so this together is the fourth and final strand in the braided cord I've described, or the fourth complex set of processes that constitute the living, breathing, moving activity of a Catholic university carrying out its mission. And without this particular set of activities occurring, history has shown that the whole endeavor of Catholic higher education is in danger of falling apart. Maybe not overnight, but in a slow decline and drift towards secularization. As the King James Version of Proverbs 29:18 puts it, where there is no vision, the people perish. But the Church's hope for the world is too beautiful, and the treasure of its intellectual heritage too rich and inspiring for indifference here to be the primary response. The Catholic Church has something here that's too good to let go, or let go easily. All it takes is a little education to reignite the flame and spark a process of renewal.